What is this Suez Crisis I keep hearing about?
It all started on July the 26th, 1956, when the President of Egypt, Abdel Nasser, only made the Suez Canal Company available to Egyptian citizens.
What's so bad about that?
The canal was a vital passage for oil that both France and Britain used. With the canal blocked, the French and British economy could be ruined.
So did Britain and France invade Egypt to get back their rights to use the canal?
They wanted to, however President Nasser ran the canal like a business and even reimbursed France and Britain for any losses they may have encountered by losing their privilege to use the canal. So, Britain and France had no reasonable excuse to invade Egypt.
So what did they do?
The French and British continued to make plans for a military strike.
They just needed a reason to invade.
Yes, and they found it after speaking with the officials from Israel, who were an ally in the war against Nasser. Israel agreed to launch a major strike against Egypt.
And what did France and Britain do after the Israeli strike?
France and Britain expressed their concern for peace and sent peacekeepers to separate the Israeli and Egyptian armies.
So by having Israel attack Egypt gave the French and British an excuse to send forces into Egypt? That is so sneaky of the French and British.
Indeed. However, the American President, Dwight D. Eisenhower, became worried about the likelihood of war and repeatedly urged British Prime Minister Anthony Eden to avoid using force.
But Eden refused, didn't he?
Yes. The Suez Crisis became one of the worst breaks between American and British relations in the 20th century.
Why do I keep hearing about Lester B. Pearson then? It doesn't sound like the Suez Crisis has anything to do with Canada.
And that is why Canada became the perfect middle ground between Britain and the United States, whose conflict continued.
Oh, because Canada had no economic or military interest in the canal. And also because we are allies with both Great Britain and the United States.
Correct.
So what does Lester B. Pearson have to do with any of this?
Throughout the summer and fall of 1956, Pearson did not accomplish any means of peace between the conflicting nations.
Oh no.
Once Israel invaded Egypt, Britain and France took on their disguise as peacekeepers and began bombing Egyptian positions. Both France and Britain were condemned by the United Nations.
But when did Lester B. Pearson step in?
Pearson saw that the situation was getting worse and proposed the first United Nations peacekeeping force. His first idea was to convert the invading French and British forces into real peacekeepers with a mandate from the UN.
I bet France and Britain didn't like that.
You bet right. The fury from the General Assembly and from Washington did not allow Pearson's plan to be set into action.
What was his second idea?
After abandoning his first idea, Pearson comes up with a plan to create a real UN peacekeeping force with no French or British forces. Pearson worked closely with all parties across all divisions and finally put together a coalition over 4 hectic and sleepless days and nights.
Lester B. Pearson is a very hard-working and dedicated man.
That he is. And on the morning of November the 4th, 1956, the General Assembly gives an overwhelming support of Pearson's proposal,
thus creating the world's first peacekeeping forces.
It was called the United Nations Emergency Force. Within 2 weeks, the units arrived in Egypt. British and French forces withdraw their presence by the end of 1956, and the Israeli forces left by spring of 1957.
How long did the United Nations Emergency Force stay in Egypt for?
They stayed until 1967.
Wow, that's over 10 years.
Right you are. In October 1957, Pearson became the first Canadian to win the Nobel Peace Prize.
What a great moment in Canadian history. I am so glad to be a part of a nation that handles conflict so well.